The Russians are on the back foot. They have begun retreating from Kherson. The withdrawal from Ukraine's southern city is being seen as one of the biggest retreats Russia has had to make since its invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February this year. The Ukrainian troops are advancing in the south. Kiev says it has recaptured a dozen villages in the strategic Black Sea region. It's a major setback in a region Vladimir Putin claimed to have annexed, and the West is elated. NATO feels Russia is under heavy pressure in Ukraine. While the US president feels the Russians have real problems, Putin has now announced he will not travel to Indonesia for the G20 leader summit next week.
First of all, I found it interesting they waited till after the election to make that judgment, and which we knew for some time that they were going to be doing. And it's evidence of the fact that they have some real problems, the Russian military.
The unprecedented support that NATO allies, including Italy, has provided is making a difference on the battlefield every day and remains vital for the Ukrainian progress. We have taken note of the Russian announcement to retreat from Kherson. We have to see how the situation on the ground develops in the coming days. But what is clear is that Russia is under heavy pressure. And if they leave Kherson, it would be another victory for Ukraine.
However, Ukraine is treading cautiously. As Russian troops withdraw from Kherson, Ukraine's President Zelensky says the enemy does not give us gifts, does not make gestures of goodwill. But amidst all this, the big question is this retreat real? Or could it possibly be part of a deception campaign to draw the Ukrainians into a fight the Russians have prepared for? Analysts believe the Russian position is very difficult to sustain in Kherson, and therefore it could be a real deal. The second issue is, does this halt any future Russian designs on Odessa? Does this place the Ukrainians a step closer to recapturing the south? Because capturing Kherson can also be an important enabling operation for a future campaign to recapture Crimea. It remains to be seen if the Russians will combine the withdrawal from stepped-up strategic strikes elsewhere in Ukraine. Having told the Russian people in the annexation declaration that Kherson is part of Russia, there will be pressure on Putin to justify the withdrawal and respond to his domestic audience.
Strategically, it looks embarrassing. Tactically, it looks sensible. But then in military understanding, there is a level between strategy and tactics, and that's the operational level. What clever plan have the Russians got in mind? They are masters, the Soviets were, the Russians are, of Maskirovka, deception, camouflage. Have they got something in mind which they want to spring upon the Ukrainians?
Responding to a question about the prospects of talks between Moscow and Kiev, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said Russia's decision to withdraw troops from Kherson is a positive step. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky earlier this week hinted at the possibility of peace talks with Russia, a significant shift from his earlier refusal to negotiate with the Russian President Vladimir Putin. So will the war in Ukraine witness a new course from here on? And is there a chance for peace? For more on this story, we're now joined by Gleb Makarovich, a Russian International Affairs Council expert and a research fellow at the Institute of World Economy and International Relations in Moscow. Thanks very much for joining us here on WION. Let me begin by asking you, the fact that Russia is pulling troops out of Kherson, how do you view it? Is it a major setback to Moscow and a victory for Kiev? Because that certainly is how the West perceives it.
So I would perceive that this way as well. I mean that politically it is a defeat. It is a defeat for domestic audience, for Russians in general. But according to some military experts' assessments, militarily, it could be a tactic operation to strengthen positions of the Russian army. So I think that the aim of these pullback was to save personnel, I mean troops, instead of fighting for the city, and taking more appropriate positions for further conducting of military operation.
All right. We had a guest on our show earlier who said that tactically it may appear to be a defeat, but strategically it's perhaps a smart move for Russia. Many are also wondering if this could in fact be a move aimed at some sort of deception. But now the West seems to be rather elated over this development. US President Joe Biden has said Russia's withdrawal from Kherson is a sign that Putin's troops have real problems in this ongoing war in Ukraine. How would you react to that? Does this indicate that Putin's war strategy has run into serious trouble?
So I don't know what implications will that entail strategically, but for now I can tell that saving personnel clearly indicates that things are going wrong. I mean, during the operation, not according to the plans, I think. And in this case, I would agree with Mr. Biden, but we don't know what is the ultimate aim of this operation, and I think that this decision to save personnel for further fighting indicates that Russian leadership has some plan and has resources and capabilities for further actions.
And
in
for a long
case, I think
okay.
That,
Okay, please complete your thought. Yes.
So in this case, I think that things are not so bad.
Well, you never know with President Putin, right? But why do you think Putin is not attending the G20 summit in person? Is it because he's feeling the heat with all the international pressure that has been building up? Does he feel internationally isolated?
I don't think that he feels internationally isolated because he attended other summits. He meets with foreign leaders on bilateral level. I think that he and Russian leadership in general considers attending this summit to be fruitless because for half of a year we have witnessed only speculations on whether Putin attends this summit, whether Mr. Zelensky attends this summit, and whether they are going to talk there or not, and so forth and so forth. I think that Russian leadership considered attending this summit to be fruitless, and instead of that, preparing for bilateral meetings.
Interesting. You're saying the Russians see this summit as being fruitless. But now let's look at the statement.
Let me clarify. Not this summit and not this venue. I mean, G20 is a premium venue for Russian foreign policy. But this year, the atmosphere that is going to take place there seems to be fruitless.
Okay, so not conducive for Russia this year. But let's look at the statement made by the Turkish President Erdogan. He has said Russia's withdrawal from Kherson is a positive step. Now, President Erdogan is somebody who's seen as an ally of Putin. Does this statement in a sense indicate that whatever little support Putin may have had since his February invasion of Ukraine may also be fast evaporating?
So this clearly indicates that the role Mr. Erdogan pursues in this conflict is to be a mediator, and his role as a mediator entails that he favors all, gesture wills instead of fighting and destroying the cities. I think that is the thing that indicates his statement. He does not support Ukraine. He does not support Ukrainian armed forces in this statement. He just supports postponing of fighting.
All right, that's an interesting perspective. We'll have to wait and see how this withdrawal from Kherson pans out over the next few days and what this could mean for the war in Ukraine. Thanks very much, Gleb Makarevich, for speaking to WION.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting me.
Thank you. All right, now we're also joined by William Courtney, who is an adjunct senior fellow at the RAND Global think tank in Washington, D.C. Mr. Courtney, thanks for joining us on WION. Do you believe... Thank you. Do you believe Russia is losing the plot in Ukraine as it orders withdrawal of its troops from Kherson? Would you see it as a major setback to Putin's war strategy?
It is a major setback. One can compare it with the withdrawal from Kiev early in the war and the withdrawal from Kharkiv Oblast in August. And also one can compare it with the sinking of the Moskva, Russia's Black Sea flagship. So in all three of those cases, they were kind of psychological and political blows to Russia. And now this is another major one. A number of Russians are now going to conclude that Russia is losing the war.
Very interesting. You're saying many will conclude, perhaps including Russians themselves, that they are losing this war. But how legitimate are Kiev's fears that Russia may well have mined the entire city of Kherson and that this withdrawal may actually be a trap for Ukrainian forces? As somebody who appeared on our show earlier said, Russia is a master of deception.
So Russia is a master of defection, but there appear to be indications that while Russia may well have mined a number of places in Kherson, that Russia is pulling out. There are several indications that larger elements of Russian forces, particularly their better trained forces, are pulling out, although they appear to be leaving behind some forces which have recently been mobilized and are not well trained.
All right, final question for you, Mr. Courtney. First, President Zelensky said he might now be willing to talk to Russia after all if his conditions are met. Earlier, of course, he had said there was no question of negotiating with Putin. Now you have Russia withdrawing from Kherson. Do you believe that we could finally see some progress on the stalled peace talks to end the war in Ukraine?
No, it is too early. As long as Ukraine has battlefield momentum, which it does have, Ukraine will keep fighting and the West will keep supporting Ukraine. It's not clear yet how the war is going to end, but for the time being, there's likely not to be a negotiation. Typically, negotiations take place when both sides have fought to exhaustion. That happened in the mid-1990s in the former Yugoslavia, and then the Dayton Peace Agreement was reached. We're not at that point yet in the war in Ukraine.
All right. So what exactly does this withdrawal from Kherson really mean? How is this going to pan out? Could we see the two sides returning to the negotiating table, or is that too optimistic a view? We will perhaps find out in the weeks ahead. Thanks very much, William Courtney, for speaking to WION.
You're welcome.